welcome, Professor Leila Farsakh. You are the chair and associate professor of political science, College of Liberal Arts at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, US. And your work covers fields of the Middle East, comparative politics, and politics of the Arab-Israeli conflict. So this interview will be conducted by myself and Arturo. We are both members of TM25 and its thematic DSC International Policy. We will try to cover in this interview multiple topics, starting from nationalism, put it in a historical context, a bit on the Arab-Israeli conflict, and then finish it with some questions about the UN.
Okay.
So can you shortly please talk about your current research projects and what you're working on, if you don't mind?
Yeah, thank you. My field of research has been on the political economy of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I have focused on the labor question, how much economic relationship between Israel and the Palestinians reflect the ways by which Israel has been trying to dispossess the Palestinians and actually eradicate the possibility of Palestinian state. So my first book was about Palestinian labor migration to Israel and how over the past 40 years and how this change in mobility reflects the way Israel was already deciding to get rid of Gaza, but wanted to keep hold on the West Bank by also dispossessing the Palestinians. And from there, I moved on to work on what are the alternatives for the two-state solution, because my research made me realize that what Israel was actually creating with the Oslo peace process is a reality of Bantustanization. And what I mean by that is that Israel wanted to use cheap Palestinian labor to build settlements. So all the settlements in the West Bank that have doubled during the Oslo process were built by Palestinians. But at the same time, did not want to, and by building these settlements, you fragment Palestinian areas. So by Israel pushing these settlements, preventing the Palestinians to have a unified, connected Palestinian state, they actually created a process of Bantustan. Basically, Palestinians locked in various little conclaves out of which they cannot exit without permits, and in which their employment and their prosperity is dependent really on access to Israel or to the outside market. And this reality of Bantustanization made me realize the Palestinians cannot have a state. Yes, Arturo, you have a question?
Yes, well, just to clarify for the viewer, by Bantustan, you mean the notion that the presidents or the dictators of South Africa proposed to the Black South Africans when they said they would create a village or a city called Bantustan for the Bantu. This is what you mean in this context. You compare it.
Okay, yeah. What I mean, the Bantustans were used in South Africa with apartheid South Africa, because, and it was a question of how do we give, the question that the white settlers faced in South Africa is what do we do with Black people and their political rights? Because at one point the natives are gonna ask for political rights. And what do you do with it? So their answer was the best way to deal with it is that we create homelands. Okay, so the African would live in homelands, in areas. They had 11 Bantustans. Bantustans mean the tribe, the Bantu means the tribe of African tribes. Okay, and they had various names. There was a Transkei, there was, so the idea was that the native will live in land confined, not in all their land. It compromised 10% of the land of South Africa. And in these areas, they can vote, they can have municipal services, they have economic development, dependent on the whites, but still, politically and administratively not the responsibility of the settlers. So it became famous because it was basically a form of segregation. It was institutionalizing segregation. Now, in the Palestinian context, it's very important to distinguish two things. That Zionists never wanted to rely on Palestinian labor. And Palestinians never came to play the important role in the Israeli economy that the native South African played in the apartheid. But the reason why I use the form Bantustans is to say that basically what the Israelis were willing to give the Palestinians with Oslo is a form of government and a form of self-rule that was like the Bantustans in the sense that it was not real independence, because economically you're still dependent on the outside world. And above your mobility is dependent on the settler power. So, but the reason why I bring this up, because from my realization that there cannot be a viable two-state solution because the Palestinian land is fragmented, Palestinian population cannot move without Israeli permission, I came to the realization that the two-state solution is dead and we need to think of a one-state solution. But what does a one-state solution mean? This is where my research is focusing on, because I think today everybody would agree that the two-state solution is dead. We live in a one-state reality, which means Israel controls all the land between the river and the sea, controls 5 million Palestinians divided into in Gaza Strip, West Bank, and inside 48.
Well, Professor, there seems to be actually, a disagreement about whether one-state or two-state solution. This is a source of debates, both within conservative, liberal camp, as well as within the left. Within the left, I see, like Professor Noam Chomsky, Professor Norman Finkelstein, and as well as some Palestinians, such as Mouin Rabbani, who, though he idealizes, though he finds the one state by far preferable, eventually, when it becomes, when the means present themselves, they do advocate this UN Resolution 242, and so there is a kind of discord or a kind of debate going on.
Of course, yeah. But my research is precisely on trying to dissect this debate and also to show how do you make a one-state, what does a one-state solution mean? One-state solution means that everybody has equal rights. How do you get to that point when you have also two different people claiming national self-determination? So how do we find a solution to meeting individual and collective political rights through equality? Because right now, Israel has decided the only one who has the right to self-determination is in the land of Israel, is Israel. Yes. The Palestinians can claim it, but now, effectively on the ground, they are the weakest. So the Palestinians need to change the debate in a way by not saying, okay, we just want a one-state solution. And what does a one-state solution mean? How do you give rights to all the Palestinians, but also how do you deal with Israeli rights in a way by which they are not settlers? Okay, so that's, if we had the solution, we would already have implemented it. So, but thinking about these difficult questions, and thinking about this difficult question entails that we need to go and think about political rights in general in the region, that we need to reclaim, go away from nationalism, it fits with your discussion, we need to move away from nationalism. Nationalism did its role, but and we need to think of how do we reclaim a Middle East and a Palestine which is inclusive of different people, of that Zionism does not represent all the Jews. So there's something called Arab Jews who are part of it. How do you reclaim them? And how do you reclaim the rights of all Arabs to equality and justice, which we see doesn't exist in Syria or in Iraq or in the Emirates, for a matter, or
So, but Professor, I find it very interesting that you say that a binational solution is a way to set nationalisms aside. So Palestinian nationalism, Arab nationalisms, and Zionism, which is Jewish nationalism, have fulfilled any historical role, positive or negative, that they had to fulfill. Because isn't the one-state solution actually the goal of Palestinian nationalism? Like, I find this interesting. Like, how do you set?
Palestinian, it's very interesting because Palestinian have the first program of the Palestinian PLO in 1971 was the call for a secular democratic state, for a secular state, democratic state in all of Palestine, inclusive of Jews, Muslims, and Christians. Yes, but the Palestinian national movement never adopted the binational state. The one who advocated for a binational state were what we call the humanist Zionists of the 1930s and 40s, people like Martin Buber and Ethan Magnus. They thought of a binational state. The issue, I think, today for the Palestinians is, what makes it easier to talk about the one-state solution is that the Palestinians always proposed it. But I think for it to have political weight and to have any success, it needs to be spelled out a little bit more. Because at the time, it talked about individual rights for the Jews. It did not talk about collective rights for the Jews. At the time, Israel was only 20 years old. Today, we're talking about an Israel who's 70 years old, 70 years old, 72 years old. What are you going to do with the fact that you have 5 million Jews who live in Palestine, in Israel, who do not speak Arabic, don't want to speak Arabic, have developed something called Israeli culture, whether you like it or not, who have a right to live there like, you know, not oppressing others, but what do you do with their rights? Saying that they have to go back from where they come or telling them that they have to become Palestinians makes it difficult. You know, you need, like, how do you ensure equality for all without indirectly making one group economically more powerful over the other?
That's interesting, because I'm aware that in Israel, just 1 or 2 generations ago, it was quite normal to teach Arabic as the quote-unquote second language of Israel, and Israelis could understand and read Arabic. And now this is a thing of the past. Even those Israelis who descend from the Arab world, Tunisian Jews or Moroccan Jews, Yemenis, they don't read Arabic like their parents do. So I'm sure Mohammad is anxiously waiting to deploy.
Yeah, thanks. If I can just take a bit step away from the Israeli-Arab conflict and talk about just in general nationalism, that there were 2 different kind of waves. Like European nationalism was based more on protecting a market, so it's kind of an economy reflected nationalism, whereas if I just focus on the Arab nationalism, it was more of a way to fight colonization. So it created a collective identity that was hidden under the Ottoman Empire. Can I say it that way? And how and did they interact with
Europe? Many nations found that nationalism was a way to stand up to oppression. It wasn't merely to protect the liberal markets. And that in Zionism,
yeah, but also in Europe, it emerged everywhere. Nationalism was an economic and political process. In Europe, when nationalism developed, it was a way of affirming a group's right to self-determination and being opposed to imperial power. I mean, the Romanian, the Italian, the Italian, when they created their independence in 1860, it was about getting independence from Austria, getting independence from the French. So the nationalism has in it the idea that you have an oppressor that you want to get rid of, or you want to revive the nation. Also, for example, the Renaissance definition of what is a nation, you know, this spirit of being unified, having a history. Okay, now in the Middle East, you're right, Arab nationalism was really a political tool against colonialism, of course, but it also was a way of consolidating or allowing a new class of people to emerge and get power. And what happened in the Middle East is that the national project captured the state and became concerned with consolidating the state for a certain elite rather than spreading benefits to everybody. So that's where the problem happened, is that the nationalism was not combined with democratization, which in other countries tended to happen together. In the Middle East, democratization was not accompanied with nationalism because of the internal struggle of powers. Like the Ba'ath movement, which was the nationalist movement of Arab unity, ended up being more concerned with consolidating its power because it was fighting other parties, with the result of creating a more oppressive regime and oppressing all opposition forces. People forget that the Middle East had a very vibrant political parties. The Communist Party was very important in the Middle East, in Iraq, and in Syria, in Lebanon, in Egypt. You had different parties who had important roles to play. It is the 70s and the rise of petrol in particular that oppresses all means for having democracy and nationalism. Nationalism, hijacks democracy for the sake of building the nation.
So if I interpret what you said correctly, the rise of secular nationalism in the Arab world, like in Europe, had a lot to do with the rise of middle classes in the Arab world. And does this also
explain the aspiration of the middle class? The nationalism was the mean by which the middle class could assert its presence and its power vis-a-vis the landed class.
And how does that? Oh,
it's a way by which they oppose feudal lords rather than and create an industrial class, because the Middle East did not have a rich industrial class. It's the idea of creation industrial class through the state. Rather than in Europe, you had already a strong entrepreneurial industrial class that said nationalism is the way by which we can prosper more.
Of course, the Lebanese and Palestinians are famous for merchants and having a commercial ability, at least in Latin America. Most of the successful merchants are of Lebanese or Palestinian Christian descent. But so if the middle class aspirationism in the Arab countries had a lot to do with the rise of secular nationalism, where does Islamism come into all of this? Is Islamism then a response against that middle class? Or?
No, I think, well, the story is not so simple, but if we want to see the consolidation of national regimes in the Middle East happens with the rise of a new middle class. Okay, usually if you look at Abdel Nasser, if you look at Assad, if you look at, they were all what we call middle lower classes who came to power and used the state to consolidate and create a class of technocrats and middle class. Okay, so the thing about them is that this alliance between capital and state got messed up, and the state created the class and the class became dependent on it until you had the rise of the Gulf, which was not state-led growth, if you think about it, or state growth in a different way. Now, with regards to the Islamists are all commercial. It's a middle class, it's not a middle class. The debate was not over. The Islamists were still nationalists. When they came up with the slogan, Islam wal hal, Islam is the solution, their approach was not to say we want to get rid of the nation state. Their approach was we want to get hold of the nation state because the nationalists did not do a good job, and we believe we have a better way of doing it. It was replacing pan-Arabism with pan-Islamism, but fundamentally it was about having a different group of people in control of the state. Still a different, they were, it's the fact that the Islamists tended to be from rural areas who made social mobility up, if you look at Turkey, but not always in all countries where they're the same. If you look at the Gulf, you cannot understand the rise of Islamic parties without the role of the Gulf, or of Saudi Arabia, without the role of the Afghan war during the Soviet Union. That gave a whole boost to the Islamic movement. And also to the oppressive regimes in the Middle East. I mean, the first democratic elections we have in Algeria by an Islamist party, they had no intention of completely changing the state. It was just the junta in Algeria that were not willing even to let them have a chance to win, and became very oppressive of them that led to more repression.
Can I say that it's similar to what happened after 2011 in Egypt, when the Muslim Brotherhood Morsi became the president, but they maintained commercial and economical connections with the international financial institutions. So they maintained the same neoliberal market liberalization ideas. They didn't want to change it.
The Islamic parties in general have been pro-capitalist, pro-neoliberal. They have been for social welfare, but the economic plan they have been more anti-socialist than anti-nationalist. Okay, and what we see, the tragedy of the Arab uprising, that you have here an Islamic party who has capitalized on years of working grassroots and mobilizing people, coming to power and promising the army that it will be a good party like any other party. They were not planning to do any major change apart from maybe a little bit more participatory. But the army wasn't going to take that bet.
I spent some time in Tunisia around 2012 when I saw the election or the rise of Ennahda, an Islamist party, for the first time elected by democratic means. And it pretty much confirmed everything that you've just said, a movement very much orientated on commerce. More recently, we see also the strange news of the United Arab Emirates entering a pact or a coalition with Israel in some kind of peace deal. What I find more interesting, of course, is how this relates to, for example, how you see Hamas. Does Hamas fit this description? an Islamist party very much focused on liberal trade or business, at least in the future when they have power?
Well, Islamist party in general have been Islamic nationalists in the sense their claim is we want to save our country, whatever it was, whether it is Nahda, whether it is Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, whether it is Hamas. Okay, we want liberation from Zionism. Okay, all Islamic parties are nationalist parties. Their stand has been is that the way we achieve liberation, the way we make our country grow, is by referring to Islam rather than trying to copy the West. Okay, so that's really the mantra that they have. But in terms of economic strategy, they don't have any different economic strategy than anybody else in the sense of they want to promote industry, they rely on a commercial class, they rely on grassroots support because they provide lots of services. They have the social notion of collective. So Hamas, like Muslim Brothers, like a Nahda group, because they were providing services to the local population, because God said we should do that, and because it's right, and because also it generates economic, support, political support. Okay, so the situation of Hamas is a little bit more difficult because Hamas has been a nationalist Islamic party. Again, we fight Zionists because God said we should find the oppressor, not because a secular leader said it. Okay, that's their approach, and their policy has been to ensure economic development, or rather, to prevent the Palestinians from being dispossessed and becoming poorer and poorer. So you cannot talk today about a Hamas economic strategy apart from a strategy of survival, because Gaza Strip is under strangulation. Now, is it any different from Fatah? Many people will tell you in the Gaza Strip, not really, because in the end they prove to be all concerned with their own power. Do they provide more services than Fatah? Probably. Do they have more accountable institutions within them? Do they have a system of checks and balances within Hamas? They do, in contrast to Fatah. Okay. So what does it say in the end? In the end, it says every political party is concerned with its own survival rather than with democracy and participation for all. And of course, Israel is not helping the situation because the Palestinians want to do the reconciliation, but Israel has said if Fatah reconcile with Hamas, then we turn West Bank into a Gaza. And the West Bank is not going to live like the Gazans. Understand that it's a very dire situation in the Gaza Strip. Employment of over 50%, we have poverty of 64%. It's a dire situation.
And tell us about your origins, like in what area of Palestine?
My father is Palestinian from Birzeit, but I was born in 1967, so I was born after the war, and as a result, I was born in Jordan. And I have a very much Palestinian Arab diaspora trajectory. I moved from Jordan to Kuwait to Dubai. I grew up in the Gulf before the Gulf became the Gulf. But we always had contact to Palestine because my grandmother and my cousins and aunts were there. So we visited regularly. Mm-hmm. When I went to university and afterwards I worked on Palestine. I worked in Palestine for a few years. My research is on Palestine. And I visit regularly. And the other thing about me, my mother is Italian, but she adopted the Palestinian cause. That's the story.
If I can continue on the previous question that, so we mentioned UAE and Israel latest deal, and then that each entity is trying to survive and trying to work with it. Do you think that, I would not say unity, but an EU-like project in the Middle East might be viable, might help to ease tensions and create a viable region?
So the two things I need to say about that. First, the UAE-Israel deal, that's one thing. And then the EU of the Middle East. With regard to maybe we should start with the EU of the Middle East. The EU of the Middle East, if there is a core to that, or because the Middle East, you have the Arab League, the various attempts have been made to make economic agreements between free trade areas between Middle Eastern countries. It never really worked. There's the Maghreb have tried to do it. It has been more successful in the Gulf, maybe because they're smaller states, but the Gulf has practiced a form of a free trade agreement between the Arab, between the Gulf states. Now, can they become the new core of an EU? For you to become an EU, for the Middle East to become an EU, there are lots of issues that need to be settled. Okay, there's big inequality, income inequality, big economic inequality between states, but also very different political systems, although they're becoming more and more oppressive. Because right now what you have the oppressive regimes, which are rich, the Gulf. There's the oppressive regime that are not rich, Egypt, okay, Algeria. And you have the destroyed states, which is Iraq, Syria. Now we're scared about Lebanon. So you need to recalibrate the inequality and also agree on a representative political system before you can get everybody together, because authoritarian regimes tend to be concerned with their own individual wealth. Okay, for you to do an EU, you need to realize that everybody benefits from being together, even if some will gain more than others. Even when you have small countries like Netherlands with big countries like France and Germany. Okay, that trade benefits everybody, but then, and also there's a complementarity. This is not yet there in the news. And this brings me to the issue of the UAE-Israel agreement. It's an agreement which is very alarming and indicates, again, an alliance of capital and authority and surveillance regime, I would call them, versus popular desire for democracy, economic viability, survival. Because, you know, this is a deal that is going to enhance UAE surveillance techniques, which already applies on the Gulf. And it's also a way by which they're recalibrating, the Gulf is trying to recalibrate its alliance with Israel vis-a-vis Iran. So it's part of an Iran-Israel competition rather than part of a desire to create a more viable, unified, and prosperous Middle East. I hope this answers your question.
Yeah, so do you think that it should be a bottom-top movement rather than a top-bottom, like not to wait for a group of people who have the vision to create a change, rather it should be grassroots movements from different countries communicating, trying to envision a popular.
Definitely. Grassroots is very important. It has to be that with the Arab uprising, but we also saw the vehemence and the violence with which the Arab uprising was dealt with tells you that it's going to be very difficult for people to rebel again. But it is the only way. And it's happening because the whole youth are having a new discourse. The new generation is talking about rights. They're not talking about nationalism anymore. They're talking about, I don't care who is ruling the country as long as you give me my rights. So this discourse of rights, this discourse of accountability, this discourse of institution building is very important because it's one by which we're saying, okay, if UAE wants to be in control, let it be in control so long as it gives me my rights. Okay, and my rights consist that I have a right to life, I have a right to dignity, I have a right to jobs, I have a right to education. Even if some people are richer than me, it doesn't matter, but I have to have a basic right. And the only way how you can guarantee basic right is by instituting democratic institutions.
And where do you see that kind of demand or movement appearing in the Arab countries other than perhaps in Lebanon or, I mean, now 10 years after the so-called Arab Spring?
I think the Arab Spring, I don't like using the Arab uprising.
Oh, no.
We had
Okay. So you were discussing about where you see the grassroots movements or movements for creating equal rights and for envisioning an EU-like project in the Middle East. Which country do you see has this viability?
I mean, I think, look, you have to understand, I think the situation in the Middle East has never been as bad. I think the situation today in the Middle East is as bad, it's much worse than at the time of the independence struggle. And I think it's partly because the population of the Middle East, the youth in the Middle East, are redefining and saying we cannot continue with these states. You know, this is not viable. Even if the revolution or the uprising failed in Syria, even if it failed in Egypt, you still have a fact that you have a young population which is disempowered and also poor. And people accept oppression if they are being fed, but they don't accept oppression if they're not fed. So I do see that maybe, okay, in the short run, we don't know yet how Syria will turn out. We don't know yet how Egypt will be sustainable. We don't know how Iraq will be sustainable. So although we might not yet now know who are the people who could lead a new revival of an Arab uprising, I'm just sure it exists because nobody also saw the Arab uprising happening when it happened. So I believe it's there by the mere fact that the majority of the population in the Middle East is young. There's also the example of Tunis, which gives lots of hope. There's the challenge in Lebanon. I mean, Lebanon's situation is very dire, but in the depth of that darkness, you can start to see hope, because how are you going to get out of that if you're not going to listen to the population, if you're not going to give people something? I mean, the system of Iraq, I mean, what is more scary is how regional power would try to influence things. You know, like the influence of Iran in Iraq has not been positive. How would Iraqi deal with that? But you cannot deal with democracy before you have electricity running every day. You know, you can't. I mean, you need to start with your basic rights before starting to demand economic rights. The thing beneficial is that everybody knows that no state can provide. There's the end of ideology. Nobody believes that there's an ideology that's going to come and solve it. You know, it's not nationalism, it's not Islam. It's everybody has to do its part. But you need institutions that uphold the law and uphold equality. And the only way how you create this institution is by rebellion and by always checking them. There's no other way for it.
And so that's from the internal movements that can happen. And how can movements in Europe and like for example, Dean can help us? I mean, they can't tell them what they do, but how can they support them, and how can they?
I think Europe has a very important role to play. Actually, the only way how you can help the Middle East is by Europe, and in a number of ways. First of all, Europeans cannot continue supporting oppressive regimes. It's as simple as that. You know, they cannot support the repression of population. They cannot support the Sisi government. Okay, so I think Europe has a very important role as governments to sanction government Middle East countries that continue to oppress. That's one. Okay. Secondly, grassroots initiatives. I think Europe provides an incredible example. Europe came together from the midst of one of the worst wars ever that they ever had. And sometimes when I want to be optimistic, I say our situation in the Middle East today is like as bad as the one in Europe in 1945. Okay, the question is that you need the leaders who will bring people together. It's not there because there's still some rich countries who don't see it like that, who think Iran is more of a problem than Arab unity, or Arab, that still are busy oppressing their people and don't want to keep the power in a very small hand of people. So I think both the grassroots initiative, popular initiative in the EU, as well as public and government forces can do a lot to support democratic initiative in the Middle East and hold governments accountable to not repress.
Sorry, and how important is the case of Egypt in terms of the future of the Palestinians? Because Sisi was quite visibly very hard on the people of Gaza and quite cooperative with the Israeli military. And before I forget to ask you, I'm curious as to how you see the influence of Iran in the Middle East.
Okay, Egypt is it proved that it's more concerned with the survival of the regime. It's not even the survival of the country. So Sisi is more concerned with the survival of his own regime, with his own cronies. And they are very much concerned. The Arab uprising scared these governments so much that what they want to do now is enhance their surveillance state. Okay. And this is an excellent ally in this. Egypt is not interested in giving Gazans more freedom. Why? Or rights, or because that will allow other Egyptians to claim most of their rights. So Egypt is the government in Egypt is not very different from the government of the UAE or the government of Saudi Arabia. Maybe the UAE is a much more efficient government and state than Egypt, that's definitely. But in terms of interest, in terms of keeping power in the hand of a few and repressing the majority, that's the line that they have. Now, concerning Iran is a is a delicate, because Iran is a big country, has always been an important country, okay, in the region. You know. And today, when we talk about the balance of power in the region, it's no longer between Egypt and Israel. It really is between Iran, Turkey, and Israel. These are the geostrategic power in the region. Now, Iran can be, is a progressive regime between two governments, in the sense that it upholds Palestinian rights, but it is not very much of a democracy, and all attempts to democratize it have been crushed so far. Okay, so on the one hand, Iran is holding a position, is as like any state concerned with its geostrategic depth. So its concern and intervention in the Middle East is not out of altruism towards the Palestinian, it's more out of expanding its influence and limiting Israel's and Turkey's influence. So, they play in the short run some positive role for the Palestinians. I'm not too sure, because the Palestinian issues, and we see, has become marginal. It's very hard to admit it, but between the Trump administration, the EU-Israel deal, you see how much the Palestinian issue has become completely trivial to Middle East politics. And the question will be how to revive it. And I think the only way to revive it is to recalibrate it as a people's resistance against oppressive regimes. That there is a connection. The only way to free Palestine and free the Palestinians is to free the Syrians, to free the Iraqis, is to free the Lebanese, to free the Egyptian, all by creating institutions and governments that are accountable to their people. That's how I see it.
But is that now the return to pan-Arabism from the era of Nasser?
I'm not too sure. It's a pan-Arabism proved to be much more slogans than work. Okay, I see it more a civil society attempt to people to basic rights to their dignity and their life. So whether out of it will come a pan-Arabism, if it maybe, because pan-Arabism has always the individual people felt very pan-Arabist in the 1950s and 60s. But if you don't have government institutional support to support it, it also evaporates. I think I see it more now as people concerned with just obtaining the right to live. Because as I said to you, the situation in Syria is worse than Palestine. It's a fact. What Syria suffered is worse than what the Palestinians suffered. Okay, we cannot compare suffering, but it's just as bad. What's happening in Lebanon is bad. What's happening in Iraq is horrible. How a country that had one of the largest oil production in the world, that under Saddam Hussein had electricity even under the sanction. And today, after 20 years of American invasion, 70 years, they still do not have decent electricity. You need to solve this. This is what politics is about. It is about these things before the grand things. So there's no point of pan-Arabism, but what there is the integrity and the equality of everybody, and the intersectionality of such struggles. Black Lives Matters can tie to people also in Palestine.
I guess we have to finish right now, okay. And we still have a lot of questions, but I guess we can
go on.
We'll keep it for another time.
Okay. So thank you. Yeah, thank you, Professor Farsakh, for joining us.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.
And I hope to hear from you soon.
Thank you, Professor, and we hope for part 2 of this discussion.
Very good. Good luck with your work. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Welcome back to part 2 of our discussion with Professor Leila Farsakh and also my colleague Arturo Desimone. In our part 1 of the discussion, we talked about an EU-like project for the Middle East. I just want to clarify that it's not a carbon copy, but a similar where freedom of movement and is allowed between different states, and also the equality in front of the law. However, that the European Union has structural problems, serious structural problems that we at DM we're trying to tackle. One of them is that the EU started as an economic project, as economic unity, but didn't mutate into a political unity. Mm-hmm. Do you think, Professor Farsakh, from your that an EU-like project in the Middle East should first tackle political unity rather than economic unity, or should go both in parallel?
This is a very good question. I don't think you can separate the economics from the politics because both are tied together. I mean, the whole reason for creating the European Union, which started with the custom union agreement between the first 6 countries, the whole idea was if you forge economic union and interest between countries, they will make peace and they will also converge politically in similar ways. So I think this is a question that we cannot say, well, does politics come before economics? Because politics is driven by economics, by economic interest. Not only, but economic interest is what gonna make, or economic dynamics is what is going to make a project succeed politically or not. Now, in the EU, there was also the vision, the reason why there was economic union was in order to forge a political union. At the time, the political union was a democratic Europe against a communist Europe. That was the foundation of the EU, and to prevent France and Germany from ever going to war. The idea, if we integrate Germany, the powerhouse of Europe, in economic unions and trade with everybody, there will be less propensity to war. And this, we've seen it over and over again. This is how Germany got unified. This is how Italy got unified. It's something that happened along in everywhere. Now, the problem with Europe, I think, was when the Treaty of Maastricht was signed, the focus was on banking and financial benefits before political benefits. And we got into the problem of what's the relationship between state sovereignty and EU sovereignty. And that's something that cannot be, it is more complicated. Now, with regards to the Middle East, if you look at it, we've always had a very wonderful political idea behind unity, which is pan-Arabism. I mean, you would have thought that in the Middle East, union would be easier than in Europe because the Arabs always define themselves as in pan-Arabist terms, argued that the European powers, Sykes-Picot and all the European powers divided the Middle East. The destiny of the Middle East is to be unified. It makes sense politically, culturally, linguistically, and also economically. And yet you see very well how, despite the strength of this very important anti-colonial idea, this very important identity of pan-Arabism, despite the big support that the pan-Arabism had among the population, among the Ba'ath parties, despite the strength, it failed. So politics cannot work without economics. And what we mean by economic is whose interests are you forging economically to make it work?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Arturo. Yeah.
I just add two questions in response to what you brought up. So pan-Arabism, now we see a very dramatic situation where the Arab world is disappearing from the global stage, according to some commentators, with powers like Iran rising. And how does, do you see do you agree that this has happened, that the Arab world largely is receding from the global stage because of Syria? And what do you think were the mistakes of pan-Arabism? I usually think of Abdel Nasser. I know that Nasser had some tendency to repress certain minority identities in Egypt in the name of creating a homogeneous society, like the Greeks or the of Alexandria, as well as religious minorities.
Well, it's the failure of pan-Arabism that it proved that it was more slogans than actually beliefs. That's what it was. That what was surprising with pan-Arabism is that despite the popular support it had, once the Ba'ath Party took hold of the state, their interest was to protect the state and the interests of their group, rather than to spread pan-Arabism. And Abdel Nasser was a pan-Arabist, but he was not a Ba'athi. Nasser was a military man. Nasser believed in Arab unity, but also was concerned with Egypt's power regionally. So every state worked with pan-Arabism works for me so long as it defends my interests. So pan-Arabism worked when Egypt and Syria got unified, but the way Abdel Nasser did the unification was problematic because it was not about sharing, it was about ensuring that there will not be a coup d'etat against Egypt or strengthen political parties in Syria, because that then makes it a problem for him in Egypt to not have political parties. So in other words, Pan-Arabism cannot work without political participation. Pan-Arabism cannot be imposed from up, or cannot be imposed by parties who are more obsessed with their clique interest than actually the benefit of everybody. And one has to also give it, maybe it was premature, like many countries realized that first I need to get Syria in shape. First I need to have land reform in Egypt, or land reform in Syria, and land reform in Iraq, and then reach a certain stage of development that then I can make unity viable, because otherwise some sectors are gonna benefit more than others. If Egyptian industry would do better than Syrian industry if they are not on the same level, if there's not enough complementarity, you know what I mean? So the failure of Arab nationalism fundamentally was because it was more sloganism than actual conviction, and because the parties who promoted the idea of Pan-Arabism or Ba'ath were more concerned with the security of their regime or the security of their country, legitimizing their power in their country, consolidating their power in their country before doing Arab unity. Now, is how do we move forward? Can we move forward can we continue, how can we create a more Arab unity in this context? And what is interesting is that we're seeing very clearly how each state is concerned with its own survival and its own benefits. Okay. Now, in this context, you need to start small. You know, political unity will happen when there is more economic unity. As I said previously, I think economic unity and political unity is more likely in the Gulf because they have lots of economic cooperation and integration in a way. In the Maghreb, maybe they are on a good way to go. I don't know about Algeria is quite independent because of the oil. I think also the dynamic of oil has to change. When your economy relies on rent, you don't have much advantage in wanting to have economic union. When your economy relies on regional trade, you have much more interest in economic union. Middle East economies are more globally integrated than integrated between each other.
But then would the environmental catastrophe we're going through and the shift in the economies or the movements that are trying to go against fossil fuel would force the Arab countries to look more regionally and try to collaborate more regionally than just trying to fit in with the global production change, or not necessarily?
I'm not too sure, because if you look at it, I mean, one could argue that in the Middle East, you had a very good collaboration in the height of the oil economy, because you had the oil producing countries who had no labor and the labor rich countries that had no oil. So you had the workers from Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine going to the Gulf, sending back remittances back home. You could argue that migration, oil actually benefited, created some form of possible integration. But what kind of integration it made? It made an integration that was not led by fostering further economic and industrial integration. Yes, Arturo.
Well, right now, those remittances normally go to Pakistan because the source of cheap labor in the Gulf seems to have changed and seems to involve more labor from outside the Arab world, from Pakistan and India.
But the Arab country remained very important up until, one would argue that Egyptian labor, Syrian labor, Iraqi labor in the Gulf is very important, skilled labor. So labor migration from what we call labor-rich country to capital-rich country has been very important. What has been lacking is that you didn't have capital from rich country being invested in industrial goods. So you have capital from the Gulf going towards tourism, but not going towards creating an automobile industry in Syria, or to going towards, development of electricity in Iraq. Because that type, if the integration of capital and labor in different places could have created the integration easier. Right now, no, what the Gulf is doing, it's using it's making its capital through the fact that oil is still in high demand. And it's investing the return on capital in Western countries, not in Arab countries.
London.
Or in some cases, they're investing it in Africa to buy land. So we have massive investment in land in Sudan, and other African, as an Arab country, because it's a rich soil. There's good rich potential in it, but it's again idea of rent, not the idea of production. Okay, they also invest a lot in education, and actually the crisis that you mentioned has been fostering now a reliance on where do you have high technically savvy cheap labor, like Jordan, even West Palestine, Tunisia, Morocco, where you can rely on the technology, digital economy. But again, we need to go, the economy needs to diversify, and the Gulf states have not diversified because of oil. They've been trying. But still,
this is actually a problem of many former colonies of the world. For example, Venezuela, which did not really diversify its economy, did not really explore its immense potential for agriculture. So now they're in tremendous problems because
unlike Indonesia, for example. Indonesia is another country which was oil rich, but oil to diversify its economy. I mean, yes.
And this takes me to the second part of my question about, so when you mentioned, for example, if you take Lebanon, where they have a lot of money coming from the Gulf because people living there, working there, sending back money, but was not invested in creating infrastructure. And this has a lot to do with the clientism, a sectarian ruling structure that just both client like loyalties by sending the money in a certain direction. But then this has to do with also with structural political inequality and exclusive rights. So from your research, how can grassroots movements in these countries try to tackle these issues, the structural inequality due to exclusive rights
okay, so structural inequality does rely a little bit or a lot on how do you structure your economy. If your economy relies just on finance, which is what most of these countries rely on, how can we make returns in banks? And we rely on import-export economy largely, you are prone to make inequality. If you invest your money in capital, in infrastructure, or in industry or agricultural development, you are more likely to create a larger masses of people who are, more economically empowered. Okay, so you distribute the wealth more equally. Now, what happened in the Middle East, you distributed the debt more equally because people are borrowing for money to buy stuff rather than to build stuff, and then become more and more indebted. So an economy based just on finance is not going to succeed. And is going to encourage cronyism, and it's going to encourage corruption, because the only way how you can make money is to have favors or give to friends or rely on friends. So grassroots, there is a role for the state and there's a role for the grassroots. The grassroots role is to hold, again, the state accountable. We need jobs. We need equality. How do you do jobs and equality? You need, first of all, progressive taxes. You cannot have regressive taxes as we have in the Middle East, or no taxes, or taxes just on everybody equally. You have to have taxes more on the rich than on the poor. And you had to have an economic plan also that involves, jobs for people, involves some safety net that is inclusive of everybody. And that civil society has an important role to play, because it's the one who is forcing the state to say, I'm going to vote for people. I mean, in Lebanon, we saw it last year when, 2 years ago with Beirut Madinati, grassroots initiative by people reclaiming their city, reclaiming their capital, wanting basic things like collect the garbage. It's the responsibility of the state to collect the garbage. This is grassroots initiative holding the state accountable to its jobs. Yes.
So these problems, they sound a little bit similar to what you find in the south of Europe, actually, slightly, or is that?
Yeah. I mean, you're thinking now of Italy. You're thinking, south of Rome. You're thinking of Spain. But I wouldn't put it in cultural terms, or I put it more in terms of, I mean, whether we like it or not. See, Italy and Spain, however much they have problem, they are democratic countries with well-established political parties, and there are certain red lines that nobody crosses, although, Berlusconi had tried to cross them 10,000 times, okay? When you're talking about the Middle East, what is very tragic is that, for example, Lebanon is the most open society, but is sectarianly organized, okay? Sectarianism is what allowed it to have some freedom, okay? Because you could not have one supreme leader who says it's right or wrong. But sectarianism is also what is causing its demise, because people are fighting over their little pot of good rather than fighting for the good of everybody. What this tells us is that we still need a democratic country and responsible institutions.
And how much is it due to it? Like, all these problems are, I mean, I don't want to blame just on colonialism. There are also local cartels and elites, but how much is reminiscent of colonial structures that are still till now? And people should realize that these are not institutions organic from the society itself. And how can it spread?
You know, I think after 70 years that colonialism is over, I don't want to put the blame on colonialism. You know, okay. I mean, definitely, yeah, colonialism put some bad structures. It's what we did with them afterwards that matters. And it's not a question of right or wrong, it's a question of what we learn from history. So I think what we're witnessing today is that the reason why these systems have stayed for very long or are collapsing today is because they benefited certain classes of people, okay? And the question is, will these repressive regime continue to benefit the same type of people? Or is a new class of educated, rich or endowed people who can challenge the system that was existing before? I think what we see in Lebanon is definitely a challenge to the establishment, but no means of organizing politically for it. But there is a clear challenge that we did not see during the Civil War, we did not see 30 years ago.
I'm curious as to, it interests me how you said the Middle East has surpassed the phantom of colonialism after 70 years of some form of post-colonialism in most countries, because we know that you are a professor living in Massachusetts, and I've followed somewhat the discourses coming from Europe, from the academics in Europe and the United States, and there one of the fashionable words is decolonial. And it always strikes me, it always occurs to me, because I was born and raised in a former colony, and it strikes me that when people in Europe and the United States are saying decolonial, somehow it's a way to deny post-colonial history, because they're still blaming everything that goes wrong somehow on colonialism as if it's still happening. I'm talking about.
Yeah, what we know is that what we call about neocolonialism, you have if we mean a continuous structure of dominations, definitely the West still has, you know, dominant structure of domination, and it is able to maintain the structure of domination because the local elites who are benefiting from that. But I think if you just put all the blame on the West, you're excluding the fact that there is agency also in the Middle East, that there are people who chose. Abdel Nasser chose to have a war. He did not just was forced into a war. Abdel Nasser chose to repress political parties. He did not have to repress political parties. You know, so I think this is, you know, it's not a one-way street, as you know, it's trial and error. That's how history is made. I mean, I think what is important if we want is to evaluate what has happened over the past 70 years is the fact that the Middle Eastern countries affirmed their right to independence and to end of colonialism. But these Middle East states realized actually the process of state building is much harder than they anticipated. And the process of participation is much harder. I mean, it was a generation that believed, like internationally at the time, people in the 50s and 60s believed in the savior, you know. Think how people thought of Adenauer in Germany. Think of how people thought of de Gaulle in France. Think about, it's not any different from what they think of Abdel Nasser, that he's gonna be the savior. I think by the 1990s, we reached a generation where say, people are aware there's no longer any savior. There is not a father figure who's gonna save the nation. People thought that, you know, Assad make himself the father of the nation, Saddam as well. Now people are looking for leaders, but are no longer, nobody believes that there's a leader who has the magic solution. What we're talking about, do we have institutions that can keep a minimum of checks and balances?
Now, I wonder if that crisis of faith in a real secular political leader that led to the revitalization of Islamism. I know that in your work you link the disenchantment and the frustration with Oslo among the Palestinians with the revival of Islamism. And then you also go on in one of your articles to talk about how a form of humanitarian industry seized the moment in after Oslo, and abolished many or excluded many secular political organizations and non-secular, I mean, Islamic.
Well, I never really said that, because I am not into the secular versus Islamic. I find this dichotomy a little bit confusing. I think more of it, you know, the Middle East has been Muslim for very long. It was more a fight between Islamists and what nationalists, you know, secular nationalists, although they were never secular nationalists, you know, they cared more about their power. I think what has happened, I would say, as I explained last time, people tried secular nationalism, it failed. They tried Islamic nationalism, whereby Islam can provide a solution, Islam huwa al-hal. But also that there is nothing called an Islamic infrastructure system. There is no Islamic finance, which is different from any finance. You know, there is no, yeah, okay, you have Islamic banking, but it still needs to create some investment. So there is nobody has a magic solution. The solution is by working together to find a solution that guarantees equality for all, or guarantees benefits for certain people at the expense of others. I mean, any political system survives because it has legitimacy. How do you generate legitimacy? In many ways, in Europe, we generate legitimacy that, look, we are European, we're free to move, or, you know, there are some rich people, but also the poor people are becoming richer. This is a form of legitimation. So what happened in Palestine is a little bit something different. What happened in Palestine with Oslo is that Israel has managed to subcontract its responsibility. It had managed not to end the occupation, but to subcontract it to the international community. So the Palestinians who before Oslo were dependent on access to the Israeli labor market and good market, now became dependent on international aid given by Europe. What I was saying with that is the problem of international aid sometimes perpetuates dependency structure rather than empowers certain people to no longer rely on a superpower, or not to rely on their oppressor. Okay, that's the problem. So international aid, European aid has been very important to allow the Palestinians not to become poorer in the West Bank. Nothing else. But at the same time created dependency. It did not empower them to build their own industry, because however hard they try to build their own industry, Israel will not allow them to export their own industry. So if you tackle the occupation, you're not going to create any viable development, however much you put money in it. And the Europeans are totally aware of it, but they don't know what to do, because that requires of the EU to say to Israel, you need to retreat from the West Bank and Gaza.
And is this, one gets the impression that there is a humanitarian industry of sorts based in Ramallah with international NGOs coming from all over and posing largely as very philanthropical, yet they have a special culture. I hear they've risen the property value of Ramallah tremendously. I heard Norman Finkelstein speak in especially bitter terms about this. So, I wonder, how do you share that view that somehow this humanitarian industry is in itself a form of neo-colonial missionary activity?
It's more of a neoliberal agenda. It's part of a neoliberal agenda where people become dependent on debt and thus less likely to rebel. People are more indebted because they're told it's cheap money that they can use in order to buy a car or a house, and they can afford the rising prices of land because they can sell it and get more money. So it's all an economy of speculation, which creates indebtedness, which ends up with people cannot afford to rebel because they lose too much. So it's a part of a neoliberal agenda, international neoliberal agenda.
I have my last question on the Middle East. So when we talk about the Palestinians asking for rights and equal rights and freedom of movement, do you think that the UAE-Israel deal and like individual bilateral deals would not help them do that? They rather there should be a big block of population trying to push for equal rights on the big stage, or no, they can do it bilaterally.
What do you mean bilaterally?
I mean, like there's each country would do normalization deals with Israel, like the UAE-Israel deal, or maybe afterwards.
Yeah, but the EU,
UAE.
The UAE-Israel deal is about the interest of the UAE and the interest of the Emirates and interest of Israel. It has nothing to do with the Palestinians. They don't give a damn about the Palestinians. What's clear about it is that Israel wants to normalize because it's a way by which it stabilizes its presence in the region. It counters Iran, okay? And at the same time, for the UAE, it's a way of saying, I am pushing back against Iran and I'm getting more weapons from the United States. So this is just proves to you that United Arab Emirates deal with Israel proves to you, again, the state interest before pan-Arabism, interest before equality, state interest before development for all, before tackling structural inequalities, actually foster structural inequality. So no, that doesn't promote the interest of the civilians anywhere in the Middle East.
So should they align themselves with the grassroots movement from other countries so that they can push together for equal rights? That's the way.
What is very clear, you know, as the Palestine issue seems to become marginal on the regional and even international stage, it is clear that the only way how Palestinians will get their rights is that Lebanese and Syrian and Iraqis and Egyptians and Saudis get the rights. It's all interlinked. So you're going to have this mass movement against oppressive regime, whatever they are, because there's no difference between Saudi Arabia, not Arab Emirates, or Saddam, what's his name? Bashar al-Assad in Syria. Okay. They hate each other's guts, but they're both concerned with their own power.
I'm glad you say this, because sometimes in debates with people about Israel and Palestine, I try to also point out the importance of looking at what's happening in the entire region and also caring about the Egyptian cause and the young people who are being abducted by the Sisi regime, because of course that is crucial to the fate of other people in the region, including or especially the Palestinians as their neighbors. Yeah. But it's hard. They usually tell me I'm just trying to change the subject to something slightly less interesting. So
no, it's very important.
If I can move to another topic. So first, before I still have to want to ask about the UN, but beforehand, so normally or in the last couple of centuries, that was always a notion between West and East, and they both represented certain culture, political entities. Do you think that it's with mass migration in different directions and also globalization that these West and East definitions still hold, or should they mutate, or should they use different contexts about it?
They're obsolete. East-West division are obsolete by now. Completely obsolete. We live in a globalized world. Can you tell me what's the difference between a business owner in Dubai and a business owner in London? Mm-hmm. I mean, I think they have much more interaction than they have the interaction with somebody living in Richmond in London, or somebody living in Fujairah in the United Arab Emirates. So the East-West divide is over. We live in a very globalized world. People are interacting all the time through the digital medium, but as well through a global economy. So it's more a division between those who have and those who have not, those who are educated and those who are not. I think that's a much more clear division than between East and West. Do we still have Orientalism? Yes, we surely still have it. It's alive and kicking. People still look down on the Arabs or think that they still need development. But in general, I would say both academically and non-academically, the discourse has shifted much more towards seeing the similarities of interest and the similarities of context or inequality.
So So this interaction and exchange, and when we see people retreating, saying, "Okay, we want to protect our borders," and for example, we have Brexit. One of the notions that create the border and just close it and deal with the U.S. by building a wall with Mexico. Do you think that this is the way forward after this mass migration and interaction and mutation of?
No.
How
should this is an attempt to stop an inevitable development. You know, the Mexican border is an attempt by Trump to galvanize right-wingers to support him, but he cannot win in the reality. Maybe he'll win the election, but he will not win in the long term when half of the US population now is made of Hispanic people. Mm-hmm. For how long? I mean, unless you're planning to make an apartheid, this means that you need to change the political system in the United States. Yeah. The demographic trend in America is going towards a much more immigrant population. Now, if we look at Europe, Europe has always had this problem that it's an aging continent and has been needing migrant laborers since the 1960s. This is also a trend that would continue. Now, can Brexit save itself? I doubt it. I mean, Britain now is trying to link much more with the US because they think this was going to save their economy. But a country that has elected an Indian, a British of Indian descent as a mayor of London tells you that the society is already too cosmopolitan or too multicultural to push it back. And also the forces of globalization do not encourage you to create borders. So these are typical measures that a dying regime tries to resuscitate for a while or tries through it to consolidate power of an elite. Yes, Arturo, you had a question?
Oh, yes. Well, I see often recurring in your articles the term civil society. And this is a term that is often used and seldom clarified. So quite often we are led to assume that the notion of civil society encapsulates merely or not much more than the middle class and the intelligentsia of any society. I have an inclination to presume maybe you mean something more than that when you talk about civil society in the Arab world.
What we mean by civil society typically is does not belong to the state. That's the simplistic version of civil society. This is why it's an elastic term. I mean, you know, civil society is a term, I mean it in the sense of those who are not part of the state, which means everybody. It is not just the middle class intelligentsia. It doesn't mean just individuals. It means those who are not in power, but who can hold power accountable. And the question is how much space and protection they have to actually speak truth to power. That's the big challenge, you know, because civil society has been active in especially authoritarian regime because their argument is we're not touching politics. You know, we're just looking after the welfare of the population. We just want a free press. Okay, we will not touch the president. We will not talk about the government. But our aim is to push our society slowly towards more inclusivity. But I do not mean it in the neoliberal sense of just individuals holding the state accountable. I mean it much more in the sense of all those who are trying to speak truth to power, but also not to end up in prison as soon as they speak truth to power.
But global activists, organizations, and humanitarian organizations often use the term civil society. And I hear from people I know working in NGOs that because their superiors are from Germany, they have a very limited range of freedom. Like they can't say what they want on Facebook because they'll jeopardize their position, even though they're in Azerbaijan or somewhere in the Middle East. So the civil society, when it's used to mean NGOs around the world, and the world of NGOs, even though I know is very
no, it's an industry. As you said, it's an industry. NGOs is something different. We're talking about the industry of humanitarianism. This is different from when we talk about civil society as people being politically engaged to defend their right.
Yes.
What I mean by it. Because the problem is, what terminology do we use when we don't have political parties anymore? And people don't want to join political parties. And don't want to just be citizens. Each one just goes and votes and then goes home. how do you describe this activism, this collectivity? Okay, in the US you have Black Lives Matters, you have lobbies. Yeah, people do not think of lobbies as civil society. In the United States, lobbies are considered civil society. How do you put these with Black Lives Matters? They don't come together. But what I mean by it is engagement by people in society to defend their rights.
Of course, in Syria once and in Libya a while ago, everything was owned by the state. And then the idea of civil society was very subversive.
Exactly.
In Europe, the market predominates everything more and more.
Exactly.
So,
maybe from my side, my last question is regarding the UN. I mean, historian Vijay Prashad in one of his interviews, he mentioned that the Security Council has a different spirit, or a different narrative than the spirit of the UN, that it forces certain narratives. Do you think that reforms are needed, and what kind of reforms to redistribute power and make it more just? It's a big question.
It's a big question. Also, it's a little bit of hypothetical question. I mean,
or if I can,
European, yeah.
So, or if I can just put it more, that do you think that a regional collaboration? So, if you have an EU-like Middle East, and EU in Europe, European Union, so would this create because you have big portion of the population collaborating, so this might create a bargaining leverage in different regions, or not necessarily?
I think it's really a function of the states who are member of the United Nations. I think the United Nations is a very important body because it's a body that represents all states, and it's based on the principle that all states are equal, even when and have equal rights, okay, even if they're not of equal size or equal power. Now, the Security Council, as we know, was created in order to avoid the pitfall of the League of Nations, that we need to be aware that there are powers, some powers more powerful than others. But if you look at the history of the United Nations, especially in the 60s, the third world, the non-5, the non-European world, the non-Western world, had a very important role to play that used the United Nations to defend very important concepts such as the right to self-determination, such as the definition of colonialism as a crime, such as defending the right of people to the legitimate right of fighting militarily against settler colonialism. All these come from the United Nations General Assembly, that apartheid is a crime against humanity that can be applied to other countries, not just to South Africa. So the United Nations provides it's an institution, it's a body that represents the whole world, okay, and has various institutions, which some can be effective, some are not effective. What makes them effective is how we, as people or members of the United Nations, choose to use the tool of the United Nations to our benefit or not. And what we've seen over the past 30 years is the demise of third world countries taking on the role to defend their right as their governments become ruled by a certain elite more interested in their own vested interest than actually in pushing a more progressive agenda. But this doesn't mean it will not change.
Well, I agree very much with this radical moment of the UN, especially when they all supported overwhelmingly, nations voted to say Amilcar Cabral's revolution in Cabo Verde in Africa was legitimate, even in the use of force against Portuguese colonialism. But you say in the last 30 years, but in 2008, between 2008 and 2010 or so, we were seeing with the BRICS nations talk about a BRICS bank. BRICS is the short for Brazil, Russia, China, and South Africa. We were seeing for a moment the emergence of a multipolar world order, but suddenly we have collapsed completely backwards into a unipolar world order. As an economist, a political economist, do you recognize the sudden moments of more multipolar and suddenly a collapse?
Yeah, I think we were in a multipolar world. We are in a multipolar world economically, but we might be heading towards a bipolar world again because of China. But China, the way it is working, is seeing the benefit, and it is very much interested in a multilateral world, in the notion of cooperation and trade, not in the notion of retreat. So that's gonna give opportunities for strong states. Germany, the EU will not go away because the EU is a significant economic weight. the EU has not leveraged its political power and has focused only on its economic power, because the US was leveraging the political power. Now the US going forward will probably have less leverage economically and politically. It will be interesting who is going to take that counterweight. Will it be the BRICS, as you said? In these countries, I see more hope in Brazil and South Africa. I don't know about Russia. Russia is being helped by the fact that it has gas and oil and a very ambitious president. But I don't know if it has the infrastructure to maintain a steady dominance the way that the EU, for example, has, or the way that the US has because of its technology, or China because of its strength and size.
Before we
wrap up,
I was, and this is very unrelated to economics, but I was very curious about your study of where you in your work examined the history of the non-mainstream or the more alternative Zionist groups and thinkers of the early 20th century, like Ehad Ha'am, Martin Buber, Brit Shalom, and Ilhud. I was always very interested in these intellectuals, and it did strike me to see a Palestinian interested in these and referring to them. How far did this exploration go of these?
I think it's very important. I mean, it comes from a place whereby I'm somebody who believes in the humanity of everybody. I mean, it's a choice whether you want to see the humanity of other or a choice not to see it. And I do believe in the importance in justice for all. I am somebody who is very much committed to that. So, and from my point of view the way I was raised in a very Palestinian way. I was very conscious politically from very early on. But I was also told that you need to know your enemy. And once you start knowing your enemy, you realize that your enemy is much more diverse than you think. My enemy is not just, the Israeli or the Zionist is not just Netanyahu. It has a wide spectrum of people who were actually dealing with issues which are fundamental, which are common to everyone, which is what do I do when I feel out of place, okay? The Zionism emerged because these were Jews who were rejected because they were Jews, which is like similar to us, we Palestinians rejected because we're Palestinian. So there's a universal human experience of you being rejected because of your ethnicity or because of your color or because of your nationality. And how do you solve this problem of exclusion? Okay, do you solve it by saying, okay, I'm running away, I don't want to see it, I stay in my little enclave and I try to create my little kingdom in my little hole? Or do I engage with the other despite the inequality? And I think some Zionists were involved with these questions. Others made their choice. Zionism is based on the fact that we cannot integrate. Forget it. The only solution for the Jews, and the Holocaust proved it, is that anti-Semitic is inherently psychological, it's eternal. The only way to deal with it is that we have to create our own fortress. But I read more and more stuff that some Zionists, by Zionists mean they believe that the Jews have a right to have a national home, not state, national home, to be together as a collective. In other words, they believe in collective rights. I want to be with my people, however I define it. But they also were aware that being with my people cannot be at the expense of somebody else. Unlike Herzl or Netanyahu or Rabin, who said, no, I need my state even if it is at the expense of anybody else. Martin Buber and was grappling with this idea, okay, we're rejected by Europe. We are proud of our culture called Jewishness. How do we live it without denying anybody any rights? And as we are being excluded. So these are questions, it's like for us, what do we Palestinians, is the solution to us to create our own state, or is the solution for us to create an equitable society wherever we are? Okay. And of course, I mean, I don't want to live in Europe. I'm ending up living in the West, okay? But I do not feel Western however much I've been there. But I do feel now much more cosmopolitan because I experience these various identities, because I've been confronted with that. But I want to be with my people. But I want to be with my people. How you define your people to be is a process. It's not like this, okay? And it has to be based on respecting each other as equal. Mm-hmm. And accept that we need to collaborate and disagree. And there are certain red lines we don't cross. And that's the challenge. That's the challenge of any attempt to live together. That's the challenge of Europe. Europe paid the price very, very high with the First and Second World War. This is the price in the Middle East are paying. The Arab uprising was about, we want to live together in dignity. We don't want to be oppressed by somebody who says that they represent us when they don't represent us.
the PA.
The repression that they were met with is because some leaders said, how dare you think we're not good enough for you? This is unacceptable. So for me, what is important is we need to learn about the humanity of us all, but also realizing that Zionism remains a settler colonial project. But when it is a settler, how to decolonize it is a very important question. And what is helpful for me when I was doing these studies is to realize some people who cared about the Jewish home were against it becoming a settler colonial project. Or those who realized it inevitably became a settler colonial project. Then the question becomes, how do we decolonize it? How are we treated equal and I can still speak my language? And this means you have to decolonize the structure. It means you take away the power in the hand of some and you make everybody equal, and you create the institution that guarantees economic, political, and legal equality for all. But it's not easy because some want it, others don't.
That is very central to the whole philosophy of Martin Buber, as well as any socialists, but he is very lyrical about these matters. And I much appreciate your view on this, even though I share it, because often on the left, when talking about Israel-Palestine, I'm reminded of someone else who you like to refer to, Hannah Arendt, who spoke of how people tend towards a Manichaeanism of either there is a collective innocence or a collective guilt, and that illusion hides the real culprits and the real doers. And
the real choices we take in life, because some chose to be fascist. Others choose not to be fascist. But when you choose, you take responsibility because you cannot just throw slogans. Hannah Arendt had, in my view, one of the best criticisms of Zionism. There's an essay she wrote in 1945 called Zionism Reconsidered. Already in 1945, showing how much it is an imperial settler colonial project that will collapse and be very bad for the Jewish people. Very perceptive. If you have a time to look at it, look at Zionism Reconsidered, 1945. It's in one of my essays. If you get a chance.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Farsakh, for joining us again, and we really enjoyed
thank you very much, and good luck with your work. And we'll be in touch for sure. Okay.
Sure. Thanks.
Take care. Bye bye.